Okay, so we've talked about the spinal cord in depth, and now we want to talk about the structures that enter and exit the spinal cord. We're going to learn the names of the structures, and then we're also going to learn those functional names. Again, I would point out you have to know this classification, paying specific attention to visceral sensory, somatic sensory, somatic motor, and autonomic motor. That is foundational, so please review it if you do not remember it. Okay, so some of this we've already gone through as far as looking at the different structures of the actual spinal cord itself. Okay, but now what we're going to do is we're going to look at these structures that come off of the spinal cord. They're either entering or they're exiting. Okay, and so they're going to have names. First of all, the big point where I really orient myself is one of these structures has a big bump on it, and that bump is called a ganglion. The ganglion is a general name, and what a ganglion is that is going to be a collection of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so that's what a ganglion is. And so this ganglion, again putting up the structures, this specific ganglion is going to be called the dorsal. Remember, dorsal is another word for posterior, so it's on the posterior side. The dorsal root ganglion. Okay. You have another one on the other side of the spinal cord, so this bump over here is also another dorsal root ganglion. Up on the front side here, and we also see the same thing on this side, is called the ventral root. Remember, ventral is another word for anterior. And I guess one other thing that I would point out is this portion right here, prior to the ganglion, is going to be called the dorsal root. So let's look at this other structure here. Again, you should notice this is the spinal cord, and we've got the dorsal root ganglion. Remember, that's kind of my landmark. And then on the other side we have the ventral root. Now let's reveal this and look at some other parts of this structure. First of all, right here you notice that briefly the dorsal root and the ventral root portion fuse. So this area right in this location is going to be called the spinal nerve. It then splits and a portion goes anterior, and so we call that the ventral ramus. And part of it goes posterior, so we call that the dorsal ramus. Now I have a lot of students mix up ramus with roots. And the way I remember it is I think of a woman who dyes her hair, but maybe it's grown out, and so maybe she has black hair, but you look at her roots and it's gray. Well, the roots are closest to the head, just like the roots here are closest to the spinal cord. So that's my memory trick for not mixing up a root with a ramus. Okay, again, the roots fuse. This portion is called the spinal nerve. The spinal nerve splits. The part that goes posterior is the dorsal ramus. The part that goes anterior is the ventral ramus. And then here's another split that comes off of it. We've got these two little lines called the communicating rami. Rami is plural for ramus. We have another bulge, so it's called a ganglion, but this time it's called the sympathetic ganglion. And leading off of that is the autonomic nerve. You could also call it the sympathetic nerve. You'll see it both ways. So these are the structures that are off of the spinal cord. Okay. So now what we need to learn is we need to learn the pathway of things moving in and out of these spinal cord structures. Okay. So again, one thing I want to point out here, we're talking just about sensory pathways. And so let's look at the structures again. Here's our dorsal root ganglion right next to the dorsal root. So this must be our ventral root. They come together briefly, so this is the spinal nerve. Over here is going to be the dorsal ramus. Up here is the ventral ramus. Here we've got our communicating rami. Here we've got our sympathetic ganglion. And here's our autonomic nerve or sympathetic nerve. Okay, so let's look at some of the sensations coming in. So first of all, let's take exteroreceptors. So if you remember, those are going to be sensations of touch, heat, pain, typically from the skin surface. They're sensing the outside environment. Or proprioreceptors of the back. So that's telling you your position in three-dimensional space. It's monitoring where your muscles and joints are located. Okay, so from the back, they're going to come in the dorsal ramus. Notice the arrow direction. It's coming in from the dorsal ramus. It goes to the It goes to the spinal nerve, then to the dorsal root ganglion, the dorsal root, and finally to the gray matter, the posterior gray horn. So this is the location, this is the path that it takes. Okay, from interoreceptors of the back, so things in the back part of your body, okay, but it's sensing internal environments. That is going to take the same pathway. Dorsal ramus, spinal nerve, dorsal root ganglion, dorsal root, and then it's going to go to this lateral gray horn. Okay. Now, so just to give you classifications of where things are coming in. If it's coming in from the back, either external or internal environments, but along that back part of the body, it comes to the dorsal ramus. If it is coming from the front part of the body, or the arms or legs, either exteroreceptors, proprioceptors, or interoreceptors from the body wall and limbs, okay, that comes through the ventral ramus. If it's coming from internal organs, then it comes up through the sympathetic nerve, sympathetic ganglion, communicating rami, spinal nerve, dorsal root ganglion, dorsal root, and then to that lateral gray horn. Okay. So what I would suggest that you do, and I'll do the first one with you, is that you look here on this part of your notes packet where it says the path of sensory information. And you look at each of these examples. And so the first thing you need to do is you need to classify it as somatic or visceral. So a small cut on the skin of the back, well, that is going to be somatic. Okay, the skin is somatic sensations. So if we were to look back at this figure and say, okay, our back, what structures does it take? How does it get from the back to the spinal cord? If we listed it out, okay, we would see it takes the dorsal ramus to the spinal nerve, to the dorsal root ganglion, to the dorsal root, and then to the posterior gray horn of the gray matter, of the spinal cord gray matter. Okay, and so those would be the structures in order. So what I'd like for you to do is I'd like you to go through each of these scenarios and begin by saying, is it somatic? Is it visceral? Ask yourself, once you know that, and given this picture, which path does it enter at? Does it enter from the ventral ramus, the dorsal ramus, or the sympathetic nerve? And then what structures does it go through on the way to the spinal cord? the nerve system of the body, it's just like a highway system, and to get information coming into the spinal cord from, say, my pinky finger, it's got to go through a certain highway system. Just like if you were driving from here to Dallas, Texas, you're going to take a certain path of highway systems. You're not going to generally drive up to Nebraska or Canada and then come back down to Dallas. Okay. And so this is just saying, what are the roads, what are the pathways that you take to get from one location to another? Okay. Now we can do the same thing for motor. Motor has a little bit more complexity when we're talking about the autonomic nervous system. So let's take the somatic nervous system first. Okay. Now remember, motor commands are going to be starting in the spinal cord and then going out to the effectors. Okay, so we're going the opposite direction. So let's start with somatic motor. So that's going to start in the anterior gray horn. And let's just remind ourselves of the structures. Here's our dorsal root ganglion. Here's our dorsal root. Here's our ventral root, spinal nerve, dorsal ramus, ventral ramus, communicating rami, sympathetic ganglion, and sympathetic nerve. Okay. So somatic motor nuclei, we would start in the anterior gray horn, and we go first through the ventral root. Then we go through the spinal nerve. If we're going to the back, we would then take the dorsal ramus. If we're going to the front part of the body or the limbs, either the arms or legs, then we're going to take the ventral ramus. Okay, so somatic motor is pretty straightforward. Autonomic motor. For autonomic motor, everything first is going to stop off at the sympathetic ganglion. And I do want to point out, this is important, if you look at these divisions, you notice that autonomic nervous system has sympathetic and parasympathetic. What we're talking about right now is strictly sympathetic. Parasympathetic will take a different path. So what we're talking about is only sympathetic. Okay, so let's look at this. Okay, so let's say that we want to go to an internal organ. So we're going to start in the lateral gray horn, go through the ventral root, spinal nerve, but we always have to go to the sympathetic ganglion. And we're following the blue neuron now. So we go here through the communicating rami to the sympathetic ganglion. Okay. Now some of the nerve fibers pass straight on through, okay, through the sympathetic nerve. Some of them may synapse onto another nerve, and if we're going internal organs, then we transfer the signal to this black nerve, and we continue going down to the internal organs. Now let's say instead that we want to send a motor command to the sweat glands on the front part of your belly. We start off the same, lateral gray horn, ventral root, spinal nerve. But remember, we always make a stop in the sympathetic ganglion. So following the blue neuron, we're going, we're going through the communicating ramus to the sympathetic ganglion. Now we're going to transfer that signal to this black nerve. And notice it's got an extension that goes back up the communicating ramus and then to the ventral ramus and to the sweat glands of your belly. If we wanted to go to sweat glands of the back, we would take a similar path. We'd start lateral gray horn, ventral root, spinal nerve, communicating ramus, sympathetic ganglion. We synapse, transfer it to the black neuron. We go back up the communicating ramus. And then at this portion, we are going to go to the dorsal ramus and then to the sweat glands there. Okay, so somatic motor goes directly to its location. But visceral motor, which is the same thing as autonomic, no matter where it ends up, it always stops off first at headquarters, which is the sympathetic ganglion. Okay, so what I would like for you to do, again, this was sensory, and so now I'd like for you to switch here to this, which is motor. I do need to give you one correction. Okay, number 4 here, it says a motor command to the sweat glands of the stomach. Well, turns out not so many sweat glands in the stomach. And so what I'd like for you to do is scratch out stomach, okay, and say the abdomen. Okay, and so change that around. So motor command to the sweat glands of the abdomen. Okay, so, and I'll do the first one with you. We're going to classify this first one, a motor command to the voluntary muscles of the arm. Voluntary means skeletal muscle, and that is always going to be somatic. So we have a choice of somatic or visceral. So that's somatic. And so then we're going to look at this, and we're going to say, here's our motor pathways. Where does it start? Where does it end, given our destination? And so we will list the structures in order, which are going to be starting with the anterior gray horn of the spinal cord. We then go to the ventral root, to the spinal nerve, and then to the ventral ramus. Because remember, arms and legs are always supplied by the ventral ramus. Okay. One thing I want to point out, number 3, if we're trying to classify it as somatic or visceral, okay, it's definitely going to be visceral. Remember, visceral is the same thing as autonomic. Okay. And then it asks you to classify it as sympathetic or parasympathetic. Well, remember I said that we are only talking about sympathetic right now. Okay? So that's what you would put for the classification there. So my suggestion is try these last ones, okay, and see if you can do these, and then talk with your instructor if you cannot, or if you just want to check if your answers are correct. In fact, you could even take a screenshot and email it to your instructor and say, hey, would you please look at this? Okay. Or take a picture with your phone. Okay, so what I'd like for you to do on this next part is to look at this same information in a different way. So here we're starting with the structure, dorsal root and the dorsal root ganglion. And what you're going to do is you're going to look on these previous 2 pages to see what types of impulses travel through them. Okay. Another way you could do this is you could look on your PowerPoints and you could find, okay, here's my dorsal root and dorsal root ganglion, what type of sensations pass through this, what type of motor commands pass through this. And what you may notice is you may notice that here's my dorsal root ganglion. Looks like I have sensory information. But here, no motor commands go through it. So dorsal root and dorsal root ganglion is like a one-way street. Okay? Only information coming into the spinal cord is found there. So it says, are motor neurons present in this structure? Well, we just looked at it and we said no. And so whenever we answer no, that means that this is not applicable because it's asking about if so. Well, it doesn't apply. And the same here. There's no motor impulse, so not applicable. Okay. But we did see sensory neurons. So yes, we do see sensory neurons there. So now it's saying if so, are they visceral, somatic, or both? Well, let's go back and look. So here we had red going through, that's somatic. We had purple going through, so that's visceral. So both. So we come here and we'd say both. Okay, and then it says, is the sensory impulse going towards or away from the spinal cord? So again, we can look, what's the direction of the arrows? They're all of these sensations are going toward the spinal cord. And so we put here towards. Okay. So what I'd like for you to do is I'd like for you to go through the rest of these structures, either look at the information that you filled out in these 2 pages previous, or look at these figures and ask yourself, is sensory information going through? If so, what kind? Is motor information going through? If so, what kind? And continue to fill out this final chart here. And again, I would highly encourage you to check with your instructor once you've filled that out and see, did you get it right? And your instructor will be more than happy to help you. The last thing that I'd point out is that on page 6 of your homework, there are a number of activities that help you practice getting this information in the correct order. So this is essentially an electronic version of those worksheets that you just had that will help you go through this same information.